The neighborhood looked like the kind of place people drove through slowly just to admire. Neatly trimmed lawns lined both sides of the street, white mailboxes stood in perfect alignment, and every house seemed to follow an unspoken rule of symmetry and silence. Nothing was out of place, not even a leaf for long. It was the type of community where appearances mattered almost as much as property value, and everyone knew it. At the far end of the street lived a man most neighbors only knew in passing. His name was Harold Mercer, a Vietnam War veteran in his late 70s. He lived in a modest single-story home that looked older than the rest of the neighborhood but still well cared for. The paint was slightly faded, the porch wooden and weathered, but everything was clean and maintained with quiet pride. Harold didn't attend HOA meetings, he didn't join neighborhood gatherings, he didn't complain, and he didn't socialize much either. Most people saw him as distant, polite, but closed off, like someone who had already lived through too much of the world to care about small talk. The only consistent presence in his life was his dog, a large but gentle German shepherd named Ranger. Ranger was not just a pet. He was certified service support, trained to help Harold manage severe PTSD episodes that sometimes returned without warning. At night, when memories of the war crept in uninvited, Ranger would sit beside him, steady and calm, grounding him back to the present with quiet loyalty. To Harold, the dog wasn't optional, he was survival. Across the street, however, not everyone saw things that way. On the second house from the corner lived Denise Caldwell, a woman who had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood standards. She was deeply involved in HOA matters, though not officially in charge of anything. Still, she acted like she was. Denise was known for two things: perfection and persistence. If a trash bin was left out too long, she noticed. If a lawn grew half an inch too tall, she noticed. If a porch light was the wrong shade of white, she noticed that too. And she documented everything. At first, Harold barely registered her presence. He had seen neighbors like her before, people who believed order was the same thing as control. He stayed out of her way, as he did with most people. But Denise had begun noticing something about Harold's property that didn't sit right with her. It started with Ranger. She saw the dog sitting quietly in the yard one afternoon, perfectly calm, yet something about its size and presence made her uneasy. To her, it looked too imposing, too unpredictable, even though it never barked unnecessarily or approached anyone. That unease slowly turned into suspicion. And suspicion, in Denise's world, was reason enough to act. The first time she reported anything was subtle. She called animal control and mentioned a large, unregistered dog possibly displaying territorial behavior. She didn't accuse directly, but she didn't need to. She implied enough. When officers arrived, they found nothing unusual. Ranger was calm. Papers were in order. Harold answered every question respectfully and without resistance. The officers left after a brief inspection. But Denise wasn't satisfied. From her window, she watched Harold sitting on his porch afterward, quietly stroking Ranger's head. To her, it didn't look peaceful, it looked suspiciously too controlled, as if something was being hidden. And so she made a note. Then another. And another. What began as a single complaint slowly shifted into something else entirely, not concern, but fixation. Harold, meanwhile, remained unaware of the growing storm across the street. He believed it was a one-time misunderstanding. He had dealt with misunderstandings before in life, in far harsher places than a suburban street. So he stayed quiet, patient still. But in neighborhoods like this, silence was never the same as safety. And Denise Caldwell had just started paying attention. The second visit from animal control came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when nothing should have gone wrong. Harold Mercer was sitting on his porch, the same worn wooden chair he always used, watching Ranger lie in the shade beside him. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, eyes half closed, completely relaxed. There was nothing unusual about the scene, nothing loud, nothing aggressive, nothing even slightly alarming. But then a white animal control truck rolled slowly down the street. Harold noticed it immediately. So did Ranger, who lifted his head briefly before settling again, unconcerned. A uniformed officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. He greeted Harold politely, but there was a hint of routine in his voice, like this was already becoming familiar. "Sir, we received a report regarding a large dog on the property. We just need to do a quick check." Harold nodded calmly. He had nothing to hide, of course. Denise Caldwell stood behind her curtains across the street, watching every moment. She didn't step outside, didn't speak, didn't reveal herself, but she observed like a judge waiting for a verdict. The officer approached Ranger cautiously, though the dog did not move. No barking, no tension, just quiet observation. Harold handed over the service documentation without hesitation. The officer reviewed it, nodded, and checked the tags. Everything was in order. After a few minutes, the officer closed his notebook. "Everything seems fine here," he said. "No violations." Harold gave a small, tired smile. "That's what I expected." The officer returned to his vehicle, and just like that, the situation ended. But across the street, Denise's expression tightened. Because in her mind, fine was not the same as acceptable. Within hours, she made another call. This time her tone was sharper. "I want to report a dangerous animal again," she told the operator. "The dog is too large and I believe it poses a threat to the neighborhood. I don't think the previous inspection was thorough enough." There was a pause on the line. "Ma'am, an officer just cleared the property today." "I don't care," Denise replied quickly. "I want a second opinion." That phrase, second opinion, became the beginning of something heavier. The following days, animal control began receiving more calls from the same address, each one slightly different, but all pointing toward the same target, Harold Mercer and his dog. The dog was acting aggressively near the fence. It barked at children walking by. It appears unregistered in certain databases. None of it was true. But repetition has a way of building doubt, even where none should exist. Harold began noticing the pattern not immediately but gradually. More vehicles passing by, more officers stopping just to check, more questions that felt unnecessary, as if someone was trying to confirm a story that didn't exist. Still, he remained patient. Ranger remained calm. But calm has limits. One afternoon, after yet another inspection cleared the property, Harold sat quietly on his porch longer than usual. Ranger rested his head on his knee, sensing the shift in his owner's mood. "You're doing your job better than most people I've met," Harold murmured softly, scratching behind the dog's ear. Across the street, Denise watched again. This time, she wasn't just observing, she was convinced she was right. In her mind, the system wasn't correcting a mistake, it was failing to recognize a problem she could clearly see. And so she escalated. What began as concern had now turned into determination. The next complaint she filed wasn't vague anymore. It was direct. "That dog doesn't belong in this neighborhood." And she was just getting started. By the time the third, fourth, and fifth calls came in, animal control was no longer treating the situation as routine. What had started as a single complaint had now turned into a pattern: one address, one dog, multiple reports, all pointing to the same conclusion, yet never producing any real evidence. Harold Mercer began recognizing the sound of engines slowing near his house. At first, it was occasional, a truck passing by, a brief stop at the curb, a glance at the property before moving on. Then it became more frequent. And then it became expected. Ranger noticed it too. The dog no longer stayed fully relaxed when vehicles approached. He still obeyed commands, still remained calm, but his ears would lift more often, his attention sharper, not aggressive, just aware. Harold tried to ignore it. He had faced pressure before in life, though in very different circumstances. But this felt different. Not dangerous in the traditional sense, but persistent, like something trying to wear him down over time. Meanwhile, across the street, Denise Caldwell was becoming more confident with every call she made. To her, she wasn't harassing anyone. She believed she was enforcing safety. In her mind, she had identified a risk and the system simply hadn't caught up yet. So she kept pushing. 6 complaints became 8. Then 10. Each report slightly more detailed than the last, each one framed with growing certainty. Dog appears uncontrolled during evening hours. Possible violation of HOA pet size guidelines. Resident is uncooperative regarding clarification requests. None of it held up under inspection. Each time officers arrived, Ranger was calm, documents were valid. Harold cooperated fully, answering questions without resistance or emotion. And each time the officers left with the same conclusion, no violation found. But repetition has a strange effect on authority. After the 7th visit, one of the animal control officers quietly commented to a colleague while returning to the vehicle. "This is the 4th time this month we've been here." His partner glanced at the clipboard. Same dog, same result. "Yeah," the first officer replied, glancing back at Harold's house, "but someone really wants this guy investigated." That was the first time the system itself began to notice the pattern. Harold, however, was not told this. He simply saw more visits, more questions, more interruptions in an otherwise quiet life. Each knock on the door felt less like procedure and more like pressure. One afternoon, after another inspection ended without issue, Harold stood at his mailbox longer than usual. Ranger sat beside him, watching the street. Harold's expression remained calm, but there was something heavier behind his eyes now, not anger but fatigue. "This isn't about you," he said quietly to the dog. "You're doing everything right." Ranger tilted his head slightly, as if understanding the tone more than the words. Across the street, Denise stood in her living room, looking out through partially closed blinds. She wasn't satisfied with the outcome of the inspections, but she was convinced the problem wasn't her, it was inconsistency in enforcement. So she escalated again. She began attending HOA discussions more aggressively, bringing up community safety concerns and unverified large animals without naming Harold directly, but making it obvious enough for anyone paying attention. Some neighbors began to take notice. Not because they saw danger, but because they saw repetition. And repetition, when loud enough, begins to sound like truth to people who aren't paying close attention. A few residents started whispering, "Maybe there is something going on over there. Why so many visits if nothing's wrong? HOA should probably look into it more seriously." Harold remained unaware of most of this. He was still living in the assumption that this would pass, that eventually the system would realize the issue was resolved and move on. But what he didn't know was that the number of complaints had already reached double digits. And Denise Caldwell was nowhere near finished. Because in her mind, she wasn't repeating herself. She was building a case. The turning point didn't arrive with a loud confrontation. It came quietly, through paperwork, repetition, and a small inconsistency that most people would have missed. By now, Harold Mercer had lost count of how many times animal control had visited his property. The number didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the feeling that his home was no longer entirely his own, like it existed under constant observation, waiting to be judged again and again for the same offense that never actually existed. Ranger still stayed close to him at all times, but even the dog had changed in subtle ways. Not fearful, just more alert, always aware of the sound of distant engines, always watching the street a little longer than before. Harold noticed it, and it weighed on him more than he admitted. What he didn't know was that behind the scenes, the pattern had finally reached someone new inside the system. A senior officer reviewing repeated case files paused at Harold's address. At first, it was just another routine check in a long list of similar complaints. But then he saw the number, 14 separate reports in a short span of time. 14. He leaned back in his chair. That wasn't normal, not even close. He opened the reports one by one. Each one told a slightly different story, but the conclusions were always the same. No violations, no evidence, no issue found. Yet the calls kept coming. Something about it felt wrong, not legally at first, but logically. Meanwhile, Denise Caldwell remained confident she was doing the right thing. In her mind, persistence was not harassment, it was responsibility. If the system wasn't acting fast enough, then she would keep pushing until it did. And that's when she made her mistake. She submitted a new report, but this time she included a short video clip she had taken from her window. In it, Ranger could be seen standing in the yard near the fence. The problem wasn't the dog. The problem was her description. She claimed the dog was lunging aggressively toward pedestrians, even though the video clearly showed no pedestrians nearby and no aggressive behavior at all. Ranger was simply standing, looking outward, calm and controlled. To her, it was proof. To investigators, it was something else entirely. The contradiction stood out immediately. One officer replayed the footage twice, then paused it. "That's not aggression," he said flatly. "That's just a dog standing still." Another officer reviewed the prior complaints. The pattern was no longer just repetitive, it was targeted. And then someone asked the question that shifted everything. Why is it always the same resident? That question triggered a formal internal review. Back at Harold's home, he remained unaware of the growing attention. He was in his kitchen preparing a simple meal when another knock came at the door. Familiar uniforms, familiar questions. But this time, something felt different. The officers weren't just checking, they were studying. One of them finally spoke more carefully than before. "Sir, can you tell us anything about your relationship with your neighbors?" Harold paused slightly, confused by the shift. "I don't really have issues with anyone, I keep to myself." The officer nodded, but didn't write anything down immediately. Across the street, Denise stood watching again, arms folded, convinced that this visit would finally confirm what she had been reporting all along. But for the first time, the system wasn't just listening to her. It was questioning her. And that subtle shift, the moment doubt entered the process, was the beginning of something she didn't see coming. Because 14 complaints had finally done what none of them had before. They didn't prove Harold was dangerous. They proved someone else had been watching too closely for too long.